Hello, class. This will be the last lecture we do for our civil rights class. And as you know, last week we talked about sexual orientation. And what we did in regard to sexual orientation is we talked about what do we mean by sexual orientation, how has society defined this idea of sexual orientation, and then we gave a history of sexual orientation. And as part of this history of sexual orientation, what we did is we talked about how in antiquity, if you go back to Greek society, even Roman society, that the idea of sexual orientation and how it was dealt with was a lot different than it is about 1,000 years later. And that these societies, the Greeks and the Romans, did not see sexual orientation as a really big important issue in regard to how it treated people. As a matter of fact, as we showed in Greek society, there was an acceptance of same-sex relationships. And it was, in some ways, revered. So the question becomes, when and how does this change so dramatically? And when we look at that issue, we talk about this whole question of the redefinition of sexuality. And when we talk about the redefinition of sexuality, historically what we determine is that when we go to these advanced agrarian societies, that the approach to sexuality changes for practical reasons. And then when we go from agrarian to industrial societies, it changes again. So let's talk about some of that today. Okay, so let's talk about agrarian society. Agrarian society reinforced the idea of trying to do away with same-sex relationships. And the question is why? Well, farming, in particular, demands higher levels of fertility and larger families to supply labor power that was needed for this pre-industrial society. So during this agrarian time, what we see is that Victorian, Puritan, and colonial societies all featured highly restrictive sexual norms. And these norms become very well defined in our laws, our religion, and our social ethics. So for example, adultery or same-sex relationships were strictly forbidden and were seen as a mortal crime and a mortal sin. And it's within these very rigid boundaries that same-sex intimacy was condemned. So what we see is that pursuant to that, law enforcement repressed, censored, and arrested anyone involved in a homosexual relationship. And the penalties could be extreme, including castration. And that's the way it was in the United States for hundreds of years, throughout the 1700s, throughout the 1800s. And this doesn't really start to change until our economy shifts from an agrarian to an industrial economy. And the question is, why does that lead to changes in attitudes and behavior? Well, the shift from this labor-intensive agrarian society to a more capital-intensive industrial society meant a number of things. First of all, a man didn't need as many children to survive. So with the rise of urbanization and cities, It led, first of all, to more socialization. It led to a different type of workplace where you didn't need a lot of children. And as a matter of fact, if you had a lot of children, it was harder to survive and support them all. So these rise of urban areas and cities lead to changes economically, politically, and socially. Socially, it was more socialization, more meeting places. An agrarian society was very isolated, very individualistic. Cities were much more collective. So you had bars, you had clubs, where men could find each other for intimate relations. Or for that matter, women could find each other for intimate relations. But at this early part of urbanization, and as a result of the agrarian laws that we had before, no legal protections existed in any state to protect those living with same-sex partners from being fired from their jobs or jailed for their behavior. It was not until the 1900s that same-sex behavior became decriminalized. And same-sex behavior, even in the confines and privacy of one's own home, could be criminally prosecuted throughout the 1700s and the 1800s, and for most of the 1900s for that matter. But as we go into this urbanization era, and it continues on as views changes, as society changes, there was also changes in science and medicine. Now originally, science and medicine defined homosexuality as a disease. The American Psychiatric Association listed homosexuality as a mental illness in the late 1800s, and it didn't redefine it and remove it from the list as a mental illness until 1973. So homosexuality, according to the American Psychiatric Association, was seen as an abnormality and a deviant state. And it also talked about it in terms of perversion. Well, some of the major impetus for change in regard to the idea of same-sex relationship results as a result of World War II and the civil rights movements. During World War II, we see that it was a watershed for non-heterosexuals. Why? Well, first of all, many of the men were away at war just with other men, which allowed for access. And women now were entering the workplace and working together in the workplace in larger numbers than ever before, both of which accounted for more same-sex associations and relationships. And the number of same-sex relationships, according to historians, during World War II era and thereafter, skyrocketed. Now, originally there was tremendous resistance to this. So, for example, over 5,000 Americans were dismissed from the military because of their sexual orientation. In 1943, to reinforce this, the United States military specifically barred gay soldiers. In 1953, President Eisenhower issued an executive order banning homosexuals from working for the federal government. So what we're saying is the initial reaction to the coming together of the sexes during World War II was met with great resistance. But some of this resistance starts to change even more dramatically in the 1960s and 70s, with the growing visibility and backlash from gay groups. The 1960s and 70s witnessed greater acceptance of LGBT communities. Why? Well, first of all, if you think about that era of the 60s and 70s, there was more acceptance of different people in general. So, racial discrimination, civil rights, gender discrimination. So there was a changing intellectual attitude towards civil rights and allowing people to be accepted for who they were. And along with this changing intellectual attitude, there was a changing medical community. Medical evidence was showing different things than we had assumed up until that point. And a major contributor of this increased tolerance to same-sex relationship was when the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its list of mental illnesses in 1973. And this led to a larger social debate about homosexuality, greater awareness of homosexuality, and it reduced the stigma attached to gay and lesbian groups. And the debate continued over between these two different perspectives of same-sex relationship. Lifestyle versus genetics. I mean, up until this point, everyone would argue that same-sex relationships was a lifestyle choice. It was a voluntary choice. But the medical community provided evidence showing that there were genetic predisposers, and that this shouldn't be seen as somehow a deviant act. Sociologists began to write about how arbitrary social constructions were defining what was deviant or not, and that these were artificial constructs. So these academic and social debates challenged the traditional social consequences and consensus regarding gays and lesbians by critiquing stereotypes, by contradicting history, by showing that these kinds of relationships had existed for millennia, by showing the science that contradicted the lifestyle argument. So these changing cultural perspectives led to the activation of the gay rights movement, what was referred to as the coming out movement. Because coming out was being more acceptable, wasn't met by as much violence or disapproval. And that allowed these groups to try and change attitudes and promote acceptance. Now, when we talk about this response, of social response of coming out, I mean, obviously for many groups and many individuals, this required a lot of courage. So coming out refers to the act of a non-heterosexual to publicly disclose their sexual identity. Ellen, Rosie O'Donnell. So many high visibility individuals in the entertainment industry and in politics started coming out, which emboldened their members. So as a result of these kinds of things, the first national march on Washington for gay and lesbian rights was held on October 11th, 1987. Now at this time in 1987, hardly any state or city had adopted sexual orientation in civil rights laws, which simply meant that employment discrimination against LGBT persons was considered to be perfectly legal and acceptable, and the laws that treated people different as a result of their sexual orientation were still being applied. So organizers of the gay and lesbian rights movement believed that coming out would attract allies, that by coming out they can humanize their movement, and as part of this they can present the social science research, the medical research, which backed their claims that they were not deviant. And social science showed that these early kinds of movements led to what they called the contact hypothesis. And what the contact hypothesis was that support for same-sex groups increased when they were able to forge a personal relationship with a non-homosexual. So in 1983, only 24% of the public said they knew someone in the LGBT group. By 1993, it went to 48%, and by 2000, it went to 65%. So the number of people who associates and understood and were part of a relationship with a homosexual individual grew dramatically. And at the same time, the entertainment industry started making a number of movies publicizing the accomplishments and challenges faced by gay individuals. The Imitation Game, starring Benedict Cumberbatch. Great movie. I recommend you watch it. It was a true story about World War II and the brilliant individual who was able to break the Nazi Morse code. The Imitation Game in Philadelphia with Tom Hanks, Denzel Washington, Milk with Sean Penn, Brokeback Mountain with Heath Ledger and Jake Gyllenhaal. In television, Will and Grace in the late 1990s. All of these shows, it was shown had a major impact on people's opinions and perspectives on homosexual relationships. For the first time, homosexuals were being portrayed as noble, brilliant, important citizens who contributed to the well-being of our society. Further emboldened by that, more and more groups organized, and if you look at some of the history of some of these groups, when you talk about gay rights groups and events, one of the important groups in this context was the Medellin Society, which was organized in Los Angeles in the 1950s. And it was founded to educate the public about gay men and convince society that they were just as deserving of the right to live and work without fear of harassment as other Americans. So they worked with the medical community to explain that homosexual behavior was not deviant. They engaged in public service to counteract stereotypes and to publicize their accomplishments. At about the same time, in San Francisco, the group The Daughters of the Bilitis was founded to promote acceptance and the assimilation of lesbians into our society. In 1969, we have a significant event, which, believe it or not, I remember as a very young person. It was called the Stonewall Rebellion. And the Stonewall Rebellion was a violent reaction to a police raid on a known gay bar in Greenwich Village. And what had happened is the police for years have been raiding gay bars and arresting gays because of their sexual orientation. Now, theoretically, they were just enforcing the law. But the gay community said, why try to disrupt us and intimidate us? Just let us alone. We're not bothering anybody. So a crowd gathered of not just gay individuals, but also their supporters. And they fought police for several days and nights. And they called for efforts on the part of the city to resist police harassment and mistreatment. And eventually the mayor of New York City agreed. They agreed. And they said they would leave peaceable homosexual gatherings alone. That there was no need to have that kind of intimidation. And as a response to this, we have changing social attitudes. And what we see, for example, is in 1986, we started asking the question, do you think gay or lesbian relations between consulting adults should or should not be legal? So in 1986, 32% said it should be legal, 57% said it should not be legal, and 11% of the population said they weren't sure. By 2016, that number went from 32% to 68% saying that it should be legal, 28% saying it should not be legal, and 4% saying they had no opinion. And again, social scientists attributed these huge changes in attitudes to that contact hypothesis. Well, all of this then leads to, with the changing morals, the changing science, the changing ethics, the changing perspectives, cultural perspectives, to changes in the law. So how did the law deal with these? And we'll talk about the pros and we'll talk about the cons. The pros were that several states began to decriminalize same-sex behavior starting in the 1970s. And there's other things that go on. So, for example, in 1993, the Department of Defense enacts Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was the Clinton initiative for service in the military. So what it said for the first time in our history, that you could not ask someone their sexual orientation. And they didn't have to tell you if you did ask, so that they couldn't be barred from service in the military. That was a huge change. In 2004, Massachusetts became the first state to legalize same-sex marriage. By 2014, 18 states followed allowing same-sex marriage. In 2009, President Obama signed an act allowing same-sex couples in the federal government to receive benefits for each other. That was considered a huge change. In 2009, Obama extended the Federal Hate Crimes Act to include sexual identity. So anyone who was targeting same-sex individuals just based upon their sexuality for a hate crime could be prosecuted for that. By 2013, 16 nations, mostly European, had legalized gay marriage. And by 2015, as a result of Obergefell versus Hodges, the United States legalized same-sex marriage. So those are the pros. But during this era, there were also a lot of cons that we have to understand. So in 1986, the United States Supreme Court decides the case of Bowers versus Hardwick. And in this case, the United States Supreme Court upheld a Georgia statute that criminalized private consensual sexual behavior, specifically sodomy, which was obviously targeted towards the gay community. Now, as what you're reading show that existed until 2003, when the Supreme Court changed its perspective on this issue and overturned their precedent in the case of Lawrence versus Texas. Other cons in 1996, President Clinton, who had promoted Don't Ask, Don't Tell, signs the Federal Defense of Marriage Act, which denied same-sex couples the right to marry. In 2008, California voters approved Proposition 8, making same-sex marriage illegal and allowing states to withhold benefits and rights to people based solely upon their sexuality. Well, that act was later found unconstitutional. In 2013, we have the case of United States versus Windsor, which found the Federal Defense of Marriage Act unconstitutional. But there are still some groups that are very adamantly opposed to same-sex relationships. Falwell at Liberty University in Virginia, which is only about 2 hours from my home in Charlottesville. Pat Robertson, as part of the Christian Broadcasting Network and president of the Regents University, has constantly condemned homosexual behavior. So, although there have been significant changes, what we see is that there's still significant opposition. Let's pause here for a second.